Have you ever heard of a mystery that can fool even the most discerning eye? Well, yes. 3 suspects. 3 identical letters, but only one contains the real clue. Sounds simple, right? But I'll show you how this case debunks common logic and reveals something no one expects. Before we get into this story, tell me, are you already subscribed to this channel? If not, take advantage now, because this kind of content full of enigmas and twists doesn't come along every day. And leave a like and a comment, because that helps spread the video to more mystery-loving people. The curious thing is that this enigma isn't just a police investigation. It touches on something much deeper: how easily we as human beings are manipulated by appearances. Imagine receiving a letter that looks the same as any other, but contains a tiny detail that changes everything. How many times in your own life have you been led astray by something that seemed obvious, only to later discover the truth was hidden? What you're about to hear isn't just a crime story, it's a mental journey, a dive into manipulative strategies, mathematical logic, and a psychological game that borders on the impossible. And in the end, the revelation will make you question not only the suspects, but also the way you see the world around you. Get ready. The 3-card enigma isn't just another mystery, it's an invitation to train your eye, challenge your mind, and perhaps find answers to questions you've never dared to ask. It was a cold night when I received the phone call that would change my routine. On the other end of the line, an anxious voice reported an unusual case: 3 suspects, 3 identical letters, but only one concealed the real clue. I've seen it all in my career, from elaborate forgeries to secrets buried for decades. But something about that story made me stop, adjust my hat, and take a deep breath. I sensed I was faced with a puzzle that would require not only logic, but also instinct. When I arrived at the police station, the letters were on the table, lined up as if someone had planned a theatrical performance. They were simple, unadorned, but they carried a weight that could almost be felt in the air. And you see, life is like that too. Often what seems the same actually holds subtle differences that change everything. Like the daily choices we make, seemingly the same, but with consequences that can transform entire destinies. I looked at the 3 suspects waiting silently. Each held their version of the letter as if it were the key to their own innocence. Their expressions oscillated between fear, arrogance, and a touch of indifference. It was funny to observe how, faced with the truth, people try to put on masks. And deep down, it's no different from everyday life. We all carry hidden cards, hoping no one will notice our flaws. In that instant, I realized my job wouldn't just be to decipher the words on the paper, but to delve into what wasn't written. It was like trying to find a signal amid the noise, a detail hidden beneath layers of normality. And when I finally understood this, a thought struck me like a lightning bolt. What if the letters weren't the real enigma? What if the real mystery lay hidden in what came next? The small town where it all happened looked like something out of an old postcard. Cobblestone streets, colonial houses, and a silence that hid more than it revealed. At first glance, it was the kind of place where no one would imagine such an ingenious crime. But I learned early on, the calmer the facade, the darker the secrets it hides. It's like a fake smile trying to muffle the pain. Beautiful on the outside, but laden with untold stories. As I walked the streets, I noticed suspicious glances appearing behind the curtains. It was clear that this community harbored hidden rivalries, like a family feud that never ends. And this, my dear reader, is not much different from the relationships we cultivate in our daily lives. Even in seemingly peaceful environments, there are subterranean tensions, silent disputes, and hidden resentments, waiting for the chance to surface. There was also a curious detail. The city had a history of unsolved cases. Old crimes, shelved for lack of evidence, but never left the public's memory. It's like trying to sweep dirt under the rug. Sooner or later, someone stumbles upon it. These unsolved mysteries created an atmosphere of distrust, and each resident seemed to harbor their own conspiracy theory. As I analyzed this scenario, I began to understand that the 3 letters were just the tip of the iceberg. Perhaps the enigma was connected to something much larger, something that had been brewing in that city for decades. And if so, I wasn't facing a simple crime, but a web of secrets that could completely change the course of the investigation. The official case report described only one thing: a mysterious disappearance. The victim, a middle-aged man and a well-known businessman in the city. had vanished without a trace. No sign of a struggle, no obvious clues, just the disconcerting emptiness that leaves the mind unsettled. And I speak from experience. The silence of a disappearance speaks louder than the noise of a violent crime. It's like a door that closes without warning, leaving behind only unanswered questions. When I arrived, I saw an impeccably tidy room. Nothing was out of place, except for one detail that caught my attention: the still warm cup of coffee on the table. It made me think of how life can change in a flash. One second you're planning your day, the next you're completely gone. This sense of abrupt interruption stayed with me throughout the investigation, as if the scene screamed that something wasn't making sense. The local police seemed lost, with no concrete leads. And I don't blame them. I've been in situations like this before, where every trail leads to a dead end. But I've learned that in these moments, the most trivial detail can be the key. A mark on the ground, a misplaced word, even the silence of someone who should have spoken more. And that's precisely what made me suspect the 3 letters were not a mere coincidence. As I reviewed the reports, I noticed a disturbing coincidence. The victim had a direct connection to each of the 3 suspects. He had a business relationship with the businessman, a history of disputed inheritance with the young heiress, and a history of unresolved accusations with the former inmate. His disappearance was not an isolated event, but the center of a carefully woven web. And the more I reflected, the more I understood that those letters might have been a message from someone who wanted much more than just to disappear. I received the official call on a rainy morning. Those incessant drops hitting the window already gave me the feeling that something dark was about to happen. When they mentioned my name, I heard a mixture of relief and desperation in the police chief's tone. They needed someone who not only followed protocol, but who could read the invisible, decipher what wasn't written. And, well, I must confess, that's precisely where I come in. I arrived in the city with my old notebook in hand. It always accompanies me, filled with scribbles, diagrams, and loose sentences that have saved me in countless investigations. While others rely solely on technology, I still trust in the power of observation. And let me tell you, sometimes an arched eyebrow reveals more than any forensic report. Humans, after all, are much more predictable than they imagine. Upon encountering the 3 letters, I immediately realized they weren't simple messages. They were instruments of psychological manipulation, designed to test not only the patience but also the logic of anyone who dared investigate them. I've seen criminals leave messages in the form of music, poetry, and even seemingly banal objects. But identical letters delivered to 3 suspects? This was a bold, almost theatrical move. As I observed the suspects, I felt the weight of the challenge. I knew each of them carried a story, a secret, and a motive hidden behind calculated looks. My mission would not only be to solve a crime, but also to decipher minds trained to conceal truths. And, as I took the first step in the investigation, I had the distinct feeling that those letters were not the destination, but rather the gateway to a much deeper enigma. The letters lay before me, lined up on the table like chess pieces, all in identically sealed white envelopes, their handwriting nearly impeccable. To the untrained eye, there was no difference. But as I'd learned from years of research, the devil is in the details, and it was precisely these details that I would have to delve into. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but knowing that the needle could be sharp enough to injure if I picked it up carelessly. When I opened the first, I found vague, almost poetic words, speaking of hidden truths and shadows of the past. The second contained equally enigmatic phrases, but with a more threatening tone, as if warning me not to proceed. The third seemed too innocent, almost simplistic, as if written solely to confuse. Then I realized, one of them was the key, but the other 2 were nothing more than traps designed to mislead. I remembered other cases where criminals used coded messages to play with investigators' minds. Once, a forger left clues inside newspaper advertisements. Another, a kidnapper used song lyrics as a message. In these situations, I learned that it's not just about what's written, but what's omitted. And looking at those letters, I had the strange feeling that the real message wasn't in the text, but in the way it was constructed. As I carefully flipped through the pages, I noticed almost invisible marks on the paper, a slight difference in pen pressure, an unusual spacing between lines, tiny variations that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. It was as if someone had created a perfect scenario but missed tiny cracks. And it was at that moment that a question throbbed in my mind. If only one letter contains the real clue, what do the other two hide? I grabbed my pocket magnifying glass, that faithful companion that has helped me uncover more secrets than any police report. I began to go through the letters line by line. Like someone searching through a minefield, I soon noticed something curious. Certain words repeated themselves at unexpected moments, as if left there on purpose. Shadow, echo, and silence appeared more often than would be expected. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. And throughout my life as an investigator, I've learned that where there's a pattern, there's intent. I continued analyzing and found small, almost imperceptible symbols hidden within the margins of the text. They weren't ordinary scribbles, but calculated signs like clues to the observant eye. Most people would say it was just dirt on the paper. But I knew, nothing in a well-planned crime is the work of chance. It was like a riddle within a riddle, like a key hidden under the mat of a locked door. What intrigued me most, however, were the intentional spelling errors. Simple words were misspelled, but not randomly. There was logic behind them. Each error seemed to point to a specific sequence, perhaps a code. I remembered an old case in which a criminal used grammatical errors to indicate geographic coordinates. There in front of the letters, I felt I was seeing something similar, a coded message disguised as carelessness. It was like putting together a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit at first glance. Every detail led me to believe someone was trying to play with my mind, test my limits, and create a web of confusion. But deep down, these disguises always reveal more than they hide. And the deeper I delved into this strange logic, the more I felt I was about to decipher something that would completely change the course of the investigation. The first to be questioned was the town businessman, a man with a rigid posture and a look that tried to convey confidence, but hid an almost palpable unease. His shoes shone brighter than necessary, and his sharp suit seemed like armor against suspicion. I've known many like him, people who believe money can buy even the truth. But I've learned over the years that no amount of fortune can erase traces of guilt. He had business dealings with the victim, signed contracts, and a history of financial disagreements. On the surface, these were just ordinary business disputes. But the tone of his voice told me otherwise. When he mentioned the missing man, his words were accompanied by a slight tremor in his hand, a quick gesture of someone trying to hide anxiety. It's funny how the body betrays the mind. No matter how much one rehearses convincing lines, the body always reveals small cracks. There were rumors in town that the businessman was involved in shady schemes, disguised as legitimate investments. What if the missing man had discovered something he shouldn't have? This possibility lingered in my mind like an insistent whisper. He needed to not only defend himself against accusations, but also to protect an empire built on quicksand. The motivation in this case wasn't just personal. It was a matter of social and financial survival. As he spoke, I watched closely the way he held the letter. Unlike the others, he held the envelope firmly between his fingers, almost as if holding a proof of power. For him, the letter wasn't a riddle, but a bargaining chip, a silent weapon that could be used to his advantage. And it was in this detail that I realized, perhaps his connection to crime ran deeper than he let on, and the letter could be the key to exposing what he most feared losing. The second suspect was a young heiress, known throughout the city for both her enigmatic beauty and the rumors surrounding her. Some described her as a lost soul, incapable of taking responsibility, and others swore that behind her distant gaze lurked a calculating mind. When I first saw her, I noticed a curious detail. Unlike the businessman, who exuded rigidity, she carried an aura of practiced fragility, as if she knew exactly the effect she was having by appearing defenseless. Her connection with the victim was long-standing and uncomfortable. Inheritance disputes, family feuds, and a history of silent grudges. Her every word seemed carefully chosen, as if she were acting out a role written long before we arrived at that interrogation. The problem is that in real-life theater, there's always a line that goes off script, and it was in one of these gaps that I noticed something strange. She was referring to the missing man in the past tense, as if she were certain he wouldn't return. Rumors swirled that she was in debt, partying excessively, and leading a double life that few dared discuss in public. If the victim had been on her way to fortune, her disappearance could have been seen as a convenient shortcut. And let's face it, when money and power are involved, even the sweetest smile can hide dark intentions. I remembered other cases where inheritances had been the scene of tragedies, siblings against siblings, children against parents. Human beings, when pressured by the desire for more, are capable of justifying any action. As I held the letter she'd been given, I noticed her fingers gliding over the paper like someone caressing a secret. There was no fear in her eyes, but a strange calm, as if she already knew this would all end in her favor. It was in that instant that I understood, if she wasn't the culprit, she certainly knew much more than she was willing to reveal. And somehow, the letter seemed less a clue and more a silent reminder of what was to come. The third suspect was a man whose gaze bore the weight of a life marked by mistakes. A former convict, known for having served time for crimes the city never forgot. His presence caused immediate discomfort. His tense posture, his arms covered in faded tattoos, and a hard expression as if he had learned to protect himself at all costs. He was the kind of guy everyone points to first when something goes wrong. Not because of the evidence, but because of how easily he's judged by his past. He had a troubled history with the victim, a tangle of unresolved accusations. Some said he'd been unfairly treated in previous trials. Others asserted his criminal record was just the tip of the iceberg. Interestingly, during the interrogation, his voice lacked the rehearsed tone of the other suspects. There was raw sincerity there, mixed with resentment. It was as if he were saying, "I don't need to convince anyone, because I already know they see me as guilty." And this disconcerting frankness made me more attentive. When he held the letter, his attitude was different. He didn't treat it as proof of his innocence, or a tool of manipulation, but as if it were just another burden to carry. This caught my attention. Innocent people often cling to any detail to prove their guilt. The guilty, on the other hand, usually try to control the narrative. But he didn't seem to care. This indifference could have been a well-calculated disguise, or perhaps the reflection of someone tired of fighting endless accusations. And it was precisely this duality that made him even more intriguing. The ex-convict could be either the author of an ingenious plan or a disposable piece in a larger scheme. After all, in every mystery game, there's always someone purposefully placed to divert attention. As I observed his closed expression, I realized that somehow he was at the center of the enigma, but not exactly in the way everyone imagined. I placed the 3 cards side by side again. At first glance, they were perfect twins. Same words, same tone, same handwriting. But I knew the absolute similarity was just a trick, an invitation for any distracted investigator to give up the search. It was then that I noticed something almost imperceptible. A slightly different phrase in the 3rd card. A change so subtle it seemed intended only for the trained eye. And that's how it is with many of life's enigmas. The detail that changes everything almost always goes unnoticed. The sentence in question involved a single word swap, where 2 cards spoke of eternal silence. The other mentioned eternal echo. It may seem like a small thing, but to me it was like a scream into the void. A clever criminal knows that he doesn't need to change much to confuse. Just one small piece is enough to upset the entire board. And I confess, this kind of move sends a chill down my spine, because it reveals that I'm dealing with someone who plays not just with actions, but with the mind. I've thought about how this exchange reflected real life. How often do we misinterpret a situation because we only pay attention to the bulk of the message and ignore the nuances? A comma, a tone of voice, a misplaced word can turn a compliment into an insult, advice into criticism. With the letters, it was exactly that. The clue wasn't in the text itself, but in the hidden intention behind the change. As I reflected on this detail, I realized there was something even bigger behind it. If the criminal left this calculated mistake, it was because he wanted me to find it. But why? Was he leading me into a trap or trying to reveal something he couldn't say openly? It was at that point that I understood those letters weren't just messages, they were a psychological game, and I had just fallen for it at the first trick. That's when I realized the letters weren't just serving as clues, but as weapons. Each suspect, in their own way, began using that piece of paper as a tool of persuasion. The businessman held up his as if it were proof of his innocence, almost rubbing it in my face that I was on the right side. The heiress, on the other hand, treated her letter like a silent trophy, insinuating that it contained the truth everyone was seeking. As for the ex-convict, well, he seemed indifferent, and it was precisely this indifference that made everyone else feel insecure. It was like watching a poker game. No one showed their cards completely, but everyone knew that at some point, a bluff would be inevitable. I saw exchanged glances, hidden smiles, and even small provocations. And I can assure you, psychological manipulation is as dangerous as any firearm. What's at stake is not just the truth, but the perception of it. Whoever controls the narrative controls the course of the investigation. This game reminded me of an old case, where a simple lie, repeated too many times, became the truth for everyone involved. Here, I noticed the same tactic. Each suspect used their card to distort reality, trying to convince me that their version was the only possible one. It was as if everyone was writing a book at the same time, each trying to sway the story to their own side. And I, in the middle of it all, had to figure out which author was telling the fewest lies. It was in this tense atmosphere that I realized it wasn't enough to analyze the cards. I had to analyze how each person used them. The real clue wasn't just in the paper, but in the behaviors surrounding it. And as this psychological game progressed, I felt like I was being pulled into a board where every wrong move could cost me dearly. As I reviewed every detail of the letters, something struck me as familiar. Specific words, the enigmatic form of the sentences, even the handwriting style. It was then that my memory pulled on an old thread. 20 years ago, in a cold case that still haunts me today, I found very similar messages. The crime from that time was never solved. I vividly remember how it all ended with more questions than answers, as if the culprit himself had enjoyed leaving us confused. The similarities were striking. In that old case, 3 people were also involved and received mysterious messages. The plot seemed to repeat itself, as if someone were trying to resurrect ghosts from the past. This made me wonder, could the current culprit be the same as before? Or worse, could someone have learned from the old mystery and decided to perfect their game? Unsolved crimes are like open wounds. There's always someone willing to poke at them. I spoke with some of the city's older residents and realized that the memory of that crime still haunted many. Some avoided talking, others whispered conspiracy theories, but everyone carried the same fear in their eyes. It's curious how certain secrets survive the test of time. They're like invisible chains that imprison entire generations, and this city has clearly never freed itself from what happened 20 years ago. It was then that I realized this new mystery wasn't isolated. It was part of a continuous line, a sequence of pieces in a puzzle that had begun long before I arrived, and this realization brought enormous weight to the investigation. I wasn't just seeking the solution to a recent disappearance. I was stirring something that had lain buried for decades, waiting for the right moment to resurface. It was one silent dawn while reviewing the letters by the dim light of a lamp that I noticed the detail that would change everything. The pressure of the pen, the rhythm of the writing, and even the slant of the letters betrayed something that could not be ignored. Those letters were not written by the same hand. 2 of them had consistent, almost rehearsed strokes, but the third had something different, like a poorly calculated imitation. It was as if someone had tried to copy but couldn't hide their own identity. This detail hit me like a bolt of lightning. Until then, I'd been operating under the assumption that a single author had constructed the entire game, but here was proof that at least 2 people were involved. And when more than one mind is involved in a puzzle, the likelihood of contradictions increases. This meant that not only was there a false lead, but there was also an imposter among the suspects, someone trying to manipulate the scene to their advantage. I remembered an old case in which a group of forgers tried to imitate signatures on official documents. The expert always said the same thing. No matter how much practice one puts in, there are unconscious marks impossible to copy. The way a letter curves, the speed of the hand, even the space between words, all of this betrays authenticity. And now, once again, these small details revealed a larger conspiracy. As I stared at the letters, a disturbing thought took shape. If one of them was forged, someone was deliberately trying to frame someone else. It wasn't just about confusing the investigation, but about playing one suspect against another. It was more than a riddle. It was a silent war of manipulation. And I knew that from then on, every word spoken by the 3 of them would have to be analyzed with double care, because the truth was no longer just on the paper, but in the hidden intentions behind it. After discovering that one of the letters had been forged, I examined them even more closely. It was then that I noticed something curious. Among the repeated words and intentional spelling mistakes, a disguised numerical sequence emerged. They weren't explicit numbers, but rather strategically placed letters, almost like a code hidden in plain sight. It was the kind of trick that only makes sense when you look beyond the surface, like those children's puzzles that seem simple but conceal unseen complexity. I jotted down the letters in my notebook and soon realized they formed a mathematical series. The repetition followed a pattern that couldn't be coincidental. And when I reorganized the sequence, I discovered something even more intriguing. They were coordinates, an exact point, hidden as if it were a secret recorded in binary code within human language. I've seen criminals hide clues in songs, paintings, and even church sermons, but seeing this in seemingly trivial letters was a stroke of genius. As I checked the numbers, I realized they pointed to a specific location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The thing is, this place had been mentioned in previous investigations, specifically related to the case from 20 years ago. This couldn't be a coincidence. It was as if someone had left the trail on purpose, an invitation for me to go there. The question was, find the truth or fall into a trap? Deciphering that code made me reflect on how life also hides subtle messages, waiting for us to have the courage to interpret them. Small signs, repeating patterns, coincidences that are actually directions. Realizing this, I knew my investigation was about to take a giant leap. But along with this discovery came a chill. Whoever had created this enigma not only knew I would crack it, but seemed to have planned exactly what would happen next. Until that moment, all the clues seemed to point to the obvious suspects: the businessman with his shady dealings, the heiress surrounded by rumors and ambition. But it was during one of those late-night investigations that I noticed a disturbing detail. The ex-convict, the very one the entire town saw as the obvious culprit, was the one with the least to gain from the crime. And this realization turned the tables. After all, when all eyes point to one person, the real answer usually lies elsewhere. Reviewing old documents, I realized that the heiress, with her fragile and calculated appearance, had much more to gain than she let on. Debts, inheritance at stake, social influence, everything converged on her. What appeared to be vulnerability was, in fact, a well-constructed mask. It was like watching an actress play the victim so well that one forgets to consider the possibility that she might actually be the villain. And let's face it, this is the oldest trick of human manipulation. The shock came when I found bank records showing suspicious financial transactions linked to her name days before her disappearance. It was as if she was already laying the groundwork for the life-changing events that would come with the crime. This detail hit me like a punch in the gut, because I realized I had fallen for the psychological game myself. The innocence she displayed wasn't a coincidence. It was a strategy, and the entire city was caught up in this illusion. In that instant, I understood that the true enigma lay not just in the cards, but in the skill of those who wielded them to manipulate the narrative. And the more I reflected on this, the more I realized that what seemed obvious was only superficial. If the seemingly most innocent person had so much to gain, then perhaps everything I had seen so far was merely a prelude to an even deeper revelation. With the discovery of the true beneficiary of the crime, I realized that time was running out. The letters still held secrets, and I knew I couldn't ignore them. Between the lines and symbols, I found hints of a more complex code, something that seemed to predict future moves. It was as if the author of the letters were playing chess with me, planning each move several squares in advance. And on this board, one wrong move could mean a new tragedy. I grabbed my notebook and began mapping everything: repeated words, intentional errors, symbols hidden in the margins. Suddenly, I realized that each letter had a strategically placed highlighted letter. Together, they formed a single word: tomorrow. It was at that moment that a shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't just about solving the crime of the past, but about preventing something that was about to happen. The sense of urgency reminded me of other instances where time was my greatest enemy. I've experienced situations where every minute counted, like when I had to interpret a coded note to prevent a kidnapping. And now, faced with those letters, the lesson was the same. Haste couldn't blind me, but slowness could cost me dearly. It was the balance between reasoning calmly and acting quickly, like walking on the edge of a cliff. As I pieced together the code's logic, I realized it wasn't just an intellectual challenge, but an emotional one as well. The author wanted to test not only my intelligence but also my psychological resilience. It was as if he were asking me, Are you capable of carrying the weight of the truth before it explodes in front of you? And the answer needed to come quickly because every second that passed brought me closer to the inevitable outcome. After sleepless nights, my mind consumed by symbols and patterns, I finally realized what all the riddles pointed to. Only one of the letters was consistent from beginning to end. The others were ingenious distractions, designed to lead me down tortuous paths. But the real one, this one contained a sequence of subtle clues, hidden with the delicacy of a poet. It was as if each word were a piece of a mosaic, and together they formed a portrait of the truth. The real letter was the one that mentioned the eternal echo. I remembered an investigation years ago, where a criminal used the metaphor of an echo to symbolize actions that never die, that always return. Here, the pattern repeated itself. The echo was the disguised confession, a message saying that nothing done could be buried forever. It was the detail that connected the present to the past, connecting the case to the Lel case from 20 years earlier. Comparing every detail, I realized that authenticity lay not only in what was said, but in how it was said. The handwriting of the real letter was firm, the errors were calculated, and the logic remained intact from beginning to end. The others, however, though ingenious, revealed inconsistencies, as if written in haste or with unsteady hands. This was proof that only one came from the original criminal mind, while the others were attempts at a cover-up. When I realized this, I felt as if I had finally found the golden thread within a dark labyrinth. The real letter wasn't just a piece of paper, it was the silent voice of the guilty party confessing amid metaphors and riddles. And in that moment, I knew I was ready to confront the suspects, because the truth could no longer be hidden behind ambiguous words. I arranged to meet in the old police station, a place where the creaking doors and the smell of ancient wood already commanded respect. The three suspects were there. The businessman, rigid as a statue, the heiress, with her calculating gaze, and the ex-convict, maintaining that air of indifference that bothered everyone. I laid the cards on the table, one next to the other, as if they were pieces on a board about to reveal checkmate. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a blade. I began to speak calmly, almost as if telling a story. I explained every detail of the riddle, the repeated words, the hidden symbols, the intentional errors. I showed how two cards were mere imitations, created to mislead, and how only one of them carried the truth. Each explanation was like stripping away a layer of defense from the suspects, and I could feel their discomfort growing with each passing second. It was as if their masks were beginning to crack in the face of irrefutable logic. The businessman was the first to become agitated, claiming his innocence with exaggerated vehemence. The heiress, on the other hand, remained calm, as if she'd already expected me to point the finger at her. The ex-convict simply shook his head, as if already aware that his presence there was part of a larger drama. And it was in this contrast that the truth began to emerge clearly. The guilty are not always those who shout the loudest, nor those who remain the most silent. They are those who play for time and wait for the right moment to strike. It was then that I revealed the subtle difference in the real letter, the clue hidden in the metaphor of the eternal echo. I pointed directly at the heiress, exposing how the entire enigma had been devised to benefit her. Her expression didn't change immediately, but her eyes betrayed the secret. No shouting was needed. No confession was needed. In that instant, everyone in the room understood that the truth had emerged, and that the letters were merely a harbinger of something much greater about to be revealed. For a few seconds, silence fell over the room. The businessman stared in shock, as if he couldn't believe the heiress could be at the center of everything. The ex-convict simply gave a wry smile, as if he already knew the truth would come out sooner or later. And the heiress, well, she remained remarkably calm, which only reinforced my conviction. When someone remains so calm in the face of accusation, they're either innocent or guilty, and blindly trusting in the perfection of their own plan. It was then that I revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Bank records, hidden documents, and above all, the real letter that pointed directly to her. Her mask of fragility finally began to crumble. First, a slight tremor in her hands. Then her previously fixed gaze began to shift. Small, almost invisible signs, but which to a trained investigator are deafening screams of guilt. The tension in the room exploded when she stood up and in a firm voice tried to turn the narrative around, accusing the ex-convict of having forged the other letters to incriminate her. But there lay the error. The handwriting analysis proved otherwise. She was the one who had manipulated the entire game, creating a theater in which she expected to come off as the victim, when in fact she was the mastermind behind the crime. The shock on everyone's faces confirmed that the truth had finally triumphed over the charade. At that moment, I realized that the true culprit isn't always the most suspicious, nor the most innocent. It's the one who can manipulate perceptions, play with the limits of logic and emotion. And in this case, the heiress had done this masterfully, until the cold mathematics of the letters revealed her hidden signature. But still, something told me this wasn't the end, just the beginning of an even greater revelation. When everything calmed down and the suspects were led away, I was left alone in that cold room, with only the 3 cards on the table. They were no longer enigmas, but symbols of something greater, the truth's ability to hide between the lines. With each case solved, I realized that it's not brute force that wins, but the patience to observe the details everyone else overlooks. Life, deep down, is made up of these small signs, and those who learn to see them end up discovering much more than they imagine. I reflected on how the heiress managed to deceive so many with her mask of innocence. This made me think about how often, in our daily lives, we believe appearances without question. People smile, but hide pain. Others demonstrate fragility, but conceal calculated intentions. This duality reminds me that we must look beyond the obvious, not just in crimes, but in any situation involving choices, relationships, or trust. I also learned that logic, when applied well, is neither cold nor distant. It is the bridge between what is seen and what is hidden. It was logic that showed me the cards were not all stacked. It was logic that dismantled the manipulation. And it is this same logic that, applied to life, can save us from emotional, professional, and even spiritual traps. It's not about distrusting everything, but about paying attention to the details that tell the true story. I closed my notebook, took a deep breath, and felt a mixture of relief and unease. The case was solved, but the lesson remained. Never trust only what appears, because appearances are as fragile as paper. And just like in letters, the truth can be hidden in the most discreet word, just waiting for someone brave enough to decide to see it. Now tell me, how many times have you believed something just because it seemed obvious, only to discover the truth was hidden in the details? This case taught me, once again, that logic and careful observation are useful, not only in criminal investigations, but also in life. If you train your eye, you'll realize that there are always signs in people, in situations, in choices, that indicate much more than meets the eye. The point is, will you continue to accept everything at face value, or will you learn to see beyond the surface? Because, believe me, those who master this skill are never easily fooled again. And I want to know, what detail of the story caught your attention the most? Where do you think you might have fallen into the letters trap? Write in the comments, because I'll read each one. And here's the challenge. Next week, try applying this same investigative mindset to something simple in your daily life. Observe what no one sees, question what seems obvious, and notice the eternal echoes hidden in the little things. You'll be surprised at how much the truth likes to disguise itself. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and like it, so you can continue receiving mysteries, riddles, and reflections that will challenge your mind. After all, this journey is just beginning, and the next cases promise to reveal even more disturbing secrets.